That Saturday began like so many others in Antonio's house. The sun was already slanting through the living room window when he put the kettle on the stove and, with the usual slowness of his 72 years, set aside the 2 slices of bread he always toasted. Retirement had given him a predictable, almost comfortable routine. A widower for 6 years. He had lived alone ever since he had firmly refused his son's proposal to move into a retirement home. He liked his freedom, the smell of his books, the worn-out armchair he had bought with his wife when they still had plans to grow old together. That morning, however, brought something different. The phone rang well before the usual time. It was Enrique, his son, and there was a certain tremor, a barely disguised nervousness in his voice. "Dad, can you come over to my place today? It's Alejandra's birthday, and she really wanted you to be here. There's going to be a surprise." Antonio was a bit unsettled. It was strange to get that kind of last-minute invitation, especially coming from Enrique, who usually planned even a Sunday barbecue with military-level anticipation. But for Alejandra, his 80-year-old granddaughter, he would agree to anything. She was his darling, the only one who really seemed to care about him, who listened to him, laughed at his stories, and hugged him for no reason. So he said yes, that he'd be there around 3 in the afternoon. When he hung up, he felt a pang of unease. He couldn't explain why, but there was something in his son's tone-on, overly polite urgency, as if trying to hide something. He decided to ignore the instinct, put on his favorite shirt, the light blue one Alejandra said, made him look like a TV soap opera grandpa, and left, carrying his granddaughter's present under his arm. Enrique's house was big, modern, cold. Since his son had been promoted at the law firm and Maria had started working with luxury real estate, the family had begun flaunting a more sophisticated lifestyle. Far from the simplicity Antonio had known during his son's childhood, as soon as he arrived, he noticed the colors a bit too perfect, as if someone had set up a scene just to be photographed. The party was small, intimate, only for family and 2 classmates from the girls' school. Alejandra ran toward him like an arrow, leapt into his arms, and whispered in his ear, "Grandpa, I need to tell you a secret later. Promise you'll listen." He smiled, not understanding, and promise, do. But soon after, as he watched Enrique and Maria exchange quick glances while offering drinks to the guests, a cloud of suspicion returned to hover over him. During the party, Antonio stayed alert. It was a skill he had developed in business. Reading the room, noticing gestures, catching silences. He noticed that Enrique was watching him from afar with a smile that was a little too tight, and that Maria avoided eye contact, forcing friendliness with the others. Everything seemed a little rehearsed, as if they were waiting for something. Then, when he stepped out to get some air in the backyard, Alejandra appeared right behind him. She looked serious, different from her usual playful self. "Grandpa, I heard Mom and Dad talking about you yesterday. They were in the office and didn't know I was there. They said that today they were going to take care of the thing about your money, that you have too much for an old man who lives alone, and that they were going to do everything legal, proper, but without telling you." Antonio froze. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. He felt his stomach tighten. He bent down to be at his granddaughter's level and asked, trying to sound calm, "Are you sure about what you heard, my dear?" She nodded and added, "Mom talked about a paper you were going to sign today. She said you wouldn't even really understand it, but that it was best for everyone." The old businessman, with decades of negotiations behind him, felt then that a central piece had just clicked into place in a puzzle that had been building for months. He remembered Enrique and Maria's sudden visit to his bank a few weeks earlier, the veiled conversations about him needing help managing his finances, the times Maria had insisted on the idea of the retirement home. In that instant, everything made sense. But he didn't react with anger. He didn't shout. He took a deep breath, looked at his granddaughter, and said, "Thank you for telling me. Now, Grandpa will take care of this properly." When he returned to the living room, Antonio was no longer just the beloved grandfather who had arrived with a carefully wrapped gift. He was now the experienced man, trained to hide intentions and observe what others tried to conceal. He pretended everything was normal, grabbed a slice of cake, made silly comments with a distant uncle, and answered his daughter-in-law's questions with a gentle smile. But inside, he was on full alert. Alejandra's words echoed like a muffled alarm. "Settle it today, legally, without telling him." He now saw every detail through a different lens of sweat on Enrique's hands as he held a glass of sparkling wine. Maria pacing back and forth, avoiding being alone with him. He began to recall other moments that had gone unnoticed before. The day Maria asked if he had been forgetting names more often. The times Enrique showed up with papers just for a quick look, saying they were only a bank authorization or a registration update. All of it now seemed like a script. Antonio had always believed that growing old meant, in part, learning to live with other people's distrust. Friends had been stripped of their assets by relatives. Neighbors had lost homes because of poorly explained signatures. But he had never imagined he would have to protect himself from his own son. That hurt more than the possibility of losing money. It was a moral wound. A silent betrayal unfolding like a stage play written by the very people he trusted most. Trying to keep up appearances, he casually asked his son, "Enrique, you mentioned a surprise. Is it happening this afternoon?" His son hesitated a second longer than normal and replied, "Yes, Dad, toward the end of the afternoon. I wanted to talk to you later. Just the two of us. Okay?" That confirmation was all Antonio needed to be sure the trap was set, and he was the target. But what Enrique didn't know was that his father was already preparing to reverse the roles. As soon as the party began to wind down, Antonio said he needed to use the bathroom and locked himself in the guest bedroom. Inside, he pulled from his pocket an old notebook where he used to jot down ideas, phone numbers, and reminders. He took out his cell phone and called a name he hadn't used in years. Hector Alvarado, vice president of one of the banks where he kept part of his investments. Hector answered with the sleepy voice of someone napping on a Saturday, but immediately woke up when he heard the situation. "You think they're going to try to get legal guardianship over you?" Hector asked. "I'm almost sure. The little one heard everything. And if I'm right, they'll use some legal loophole to do it. I need you to come here with someone you trust. Someone who can sign as a witness if things get tight." Hector agreed without hesitation. He said he'd be there in less than 2 hours with a trusted notary. "Don't sign anything, Antonio. Wait for us." When he returned to the living room, his granddaughter ran up to him again, this time with a crumpled little note hidden in her hands. "If they try to give you papers, you show them this," she said. Antonio opened it and saw what it was. A child's handwriting, full of spelling mistakes, saying Daddy and Mommy said Grandpa doesn't need to know everything he signs. They're going to trick him to give them the money. The note was clumsy, but real, genuine, written with the innocence of someone who just wants to protect someone they love. That was more powerful than any legal proof. He hugged his granddaughter tightly and said, "You are the bravest girl I know." And there, in that silent embrace, he made his decision. He would face his son's plan to the end, but in his own way. Not with a fight or scandal, but with strategy, the same strategy he had used for years to grow in business, while others sank because of impulsiveness. Minutes later, when Maria appeared with a black folder in her hands, Antonio was already prepared. She smiled with that rehearsed manner, sat beside him on the couch, and called for Enrique. "Father-in-law, it's just an update of some bank things. Nothing major, you know. At your age, they ask for some registration reviews, and Enrique thought it would be good to take care of everything today." Antonio fanned out, took the papers calmly, put on his reading glasses, and flipped through them as if he didn't really understand what he was seeing. Meanwhile, he observed the sweat running down his son's temple and the slight tremor in Maria's leg. The documents spoke of emergency guardianship, of appointing legal custodians, of asset management for preventive benefit, all camouflaged under technical terms. When he pretended he was going to sign, he stood up and said, "First, I think we need a few more witnesses here. I invited 2 friends to help me understand this better." And at that moment, Hector and the notary walked through the front door as if they had been part of the plan from the start. The arrival of Hector and the notary fell like a silent bomb in the room. Maria turned pale almost instantly, as if the blood had forgotten its way back to her face. Enrique, on the other hand, widened his eyes like someone seeing a ghost walk through the front door. "Dad, what is this? You called the bank to come here." Antonio didn't respond right away. With the same calm he used when closing million-dollar contracts, he looked at his granddaughter, winked discreetly, and only then turned to his son. "You invited me to a party, but it seems the gift you had for me was something else. So I brought some people who can help me understand what you were really preparing." The notary greeted everyone professionally, opened her briefcase, and said she was there to record any type of legal transaction between the parties. Hector got straight to the point. He asked to see the documents. In absolute silence, Maria handed over the folder, her hands still trembling, while Hector read each page, making small notes with a blue pen. The silence was broken only by the ticking of the wall clock. Antonio remained seated, his gaze fixed on his son. By that point, it was no longer just about the money. It was about respect, about the trust that had been shattered like fine glass. "It's funny," he began. "You talk about protecting me, but act as if I were a burden, as if my years of work, my choices, my assets, were just an inheritance you want to get ahead of schedule." Enrique tried to interrupt. "Dad, that's not it. You're getting everything wrong." But Antonio raised his hand, asking for silence. "No, Enrique. What I got was the truth too late." The notary, beside them, continued writing everything down, every sentence, every reaction. It was impossible to erase what had already been said. This was the part of the confrontation Antonio feared most, but also the one he knew needed to happen. It was the moment when the mask of the perfect family would finally fall away. When Hector finished reading and stood up. "Antonio, what we have here is a full emergency guardianship request, including clauses that would prevent you from moving accounts, selling properties, or even signing anything without prior authorization from your legal guardian. This case, Enrique and Maria." The silence that followed was so dense it seemed to hold the air in everyone's lungs. Alejandra, quiet in the corner of the room, watched everything with wide eyes, clutching her teddy bear tightly. Antonio slowly got up, took the papers, and firmly tore them in half. "You're not ready to manage even your own egos, let alone another person's life?" Maria tried to respond but got lost in her own words. Antonio continued, "You came here with a plan to take what's mine. But you forgot I'm not just an old man living alone. I'm someone who's learned to live surrounded by dangerous people. And you, unfortunately, have become part of that group." The tension in the room was almost tangible. Enrique crossed his arms and tried to adopt a defensive tone, but the narrative was now out of his control. The truth had been laid bare, and the presence of witnesses nullified any attempt at manipulation. That's when Antonio pulled out a second folder he had brought hidden under his coat. He handed it to the notary and said, "This is the new arrangement of my will. Everything I have, investments, properties, incomes, now in the name of an irrevocable educational trust created exclusively for Alejandra Maria," let out a muffled sound, almost like a sob. "But what do you mean?" Antonio looked at his granddaughter and replied, without taking his eyes off her, "Because she was the only honest person in this room. and because her future is worth far more than your ambition." The notary nodded and began to register the change. Enrique tried to protest, saying it was too emotional, too rushed, but this time no one listened to him. Antonio continued, now with a heavier but steady voice, "This trust cannot be accessed by anyone except Alejandra, and even she won't be able to touch it until she comes of age. But I created a special clause. You two will only have access to any benefit from this estate if, over the next year, you show real change in behavior. That includes psychological counseling, volunteer work, and proof that you can put others before yourselves. All of this will be evaluated by independent professionals. If you fail, you lose all rights to it. And don't think it's impossible, because deep down, I still believe you can change. But I will no longer risk being deceived while I wait for that to happen." His granddaughter, without understanding all the details, sensed something important was happening and ran to her grandfather, hugging his legs. In that gesture, Antonio felt that, even in the midst of disappointment, there was something worth protecting, and that was exactly what he was doing. After everything was said, signed, and recorded, silence settled like a heavy shadow over that living room which, just minutes before, had been pretending to host a children's birthday party. The music from the speaker in the corner still played softly, a cheerful song that now sounded out of place, almost cruel in light of the moment's gravity. Enrique and Maria looked visibly disoriented, as if the ground had disappeared beneath their feet. Neither said a word. There were no more rehearsed smiles. No more staged affection. Only an uncomfortable silence and a weight in the air that could no longer be ignored. Antonio, on the other hand, felt a mix of relief and sadness. Relief for having been able to turn the tables with intelligence and dignity. Sadness for having had to do it against his own son. He knew that, from then on, their relationship would never be the same perhaps. There would be no relationship at all. But he also knew he could no longer live in illusion. The notary finished the last records, put the documents in her folder, and stood up, saying the papers would be made official on Monday. Hector exchanged a quick look with Antonio, a look of respect but also of sorrow. He knew that man had just won a silent war against his own family, and that such victories always leave invisible scars. As the two said their goodbyes, Enrique remained seated on the couch, Iscase lost, avoiding his father's eyes. Maria, on the other hand, looked about to explode, her eyes brimming, though it was unclear whether from anger or shame. Before leaving, Antonio made a point of crouching again in front of his granddaughter and whispering something only she could hear. "You saved me today, my little one. And one day, when you're grown, you'll understand how much that meant." Alejandra just nodded, still holding her teddy bear. And for the first time that afternoon, she smiled. A timid but genuine smile, the only smile that mattered there. Upon leaving the house, Antonio felt the wind hit his face like a symbolic cleansing. He took a deep breath and walked slowly to the car, unhurried, as if each step were a confirmation that he had done the right thing. He remembered a phrase he had heard decades earlier during a meeting with an old business partner. Sometimes protecting what matters requires losing what you thought you needed. At the time, he had thought it was a bit too philosophical, but now it made perfect sense. He got into the car, started the engine, and, before driving away, looked one last time in the rearview mirror. Through the living room window, he saw the silhouette of his granddaughter standing still, watching him leave, still holding the teddy bear in her arms. She raised her hand and waved. A waved back, and he drove off. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if Enrique would try to appeal, if Maria would make a scene, if there would be legal consequences. But he was sure of one thing. Now, his granddaughter's future was protected, and no one would ever again use her as an instrument of greed. When he got home, Antonio did something he hadn't done in a long time. He came in, took off his shoes, poured himself a glass of wine, and sat on the porch. The sky was already darkening, and the city was slowly beginning to light up, like a living organism preparing for another night. He stayed there in silence for several minutes, watching the lights turn on one by one. He thought about everything that had happened, about how life can turn upside down in a matter of hours, and how, even in the face of betrayal, it is possible to remain calm and act with dignity. He didn't feel like a hero, nor even like a winner. He felt tired, but at peace. He picked up his phone, opened the Notes app, and wrote only one sentence. Today I lost a son, but I gained the certainty that my granddaughter will never be left in the wrong hands. After that, he closed the phone and set it aside. For the first time in months, he felt no need to review spreadsheets, answer emails, or think about wills. He just wanted to stay there, quietly, and being there was enough. Later that night, while the world slept, Antonio was awakened by a notification on his phone. It was a message from an unknown number. When he opened it, he read, "Thank you for not yelling, for not humiliating me. I deserved it, but you didn't do it. I don't yet know how to fix this, but I wanted to say I'm sorry." And Antonio stared at the screen. For a few minutes, without replying, the words were there, raw, but loaded with something he no longer expected. Remorse. He didn't know if it was sincere or just another attempt to rebuild the bridge out of convenience. But at that moment, he chose to believe it was real. That perhaps something inside his son had been touched by the way he had handled everything. He put the phone away without replying. He didn't need to say anything now. Some things, when they are true, require no haste. And if they were lies, time would take care of revealing them. For now, it was enough to know that his granddaughter was safe. The rest, life would handle. The next morning, Antonio woke up earlier than usual, not out of anxiety, but out of habit. His mind still worked like that of an executive, used to handling pressures before the first coffee. He got up, prepared the same simple breakfast as always: black coffee, toasted bread, and a slice of papaya, and sat at the table, feeling a strange kind of calm. Deep down, there was a sense of mission accomplished. As he bit into the bread, he looked at the portrait of his late wife, still framed on the living room wall. "You would have been proud of our granddaughter," he murmured, as if she were still there to hear him. And perhaps she was. That was how he dealt with loneliness, talking to the emptiness, feeling presence in what was gone. He knew the hardest part was not the confrontation, but what would come after. The rebuilding or the complete absence of it. And that was something that no longer depended on him. For the first time in a long while, Antonio would leave it to life to show who really wanted to be by his side. Shortly after breakfast, he decided to visit the notary's office where the clerk worked to ensure that everything was being processed as agreed. He was received with respect, like an old acquaintance who, despite his age, still had firmness in his gaze and clarity in his speech. While reviewing the documents, he noticed a detail he had overlooked. The notary had included an additional protection clause, preventing any contestation of the trust from being made without prior judicial authorization. "An extra precaution? I thought you deserved that," she said with a discreet smile. Antonio thanked her with a firm handshake. That reinforced his feeling that he was not alone. There were still decent people who did the right thing, not out of obligation, but because they knew the right thing needed to be done. Leaving the notary's office, he walked through the streets with a lighter step. The problems were still there, but so was he, and now more prepared than ever. During the following week, Antonio was met with silence. No call from Enrique, no visit. Maria didn't send a message, didn't show up, didn't even try to reach out through others. It was as if, faced with exposure, they had retreated into their own wounded pride, and that, though predictable, still hurt. Didn't war. He never had. He just wanted respect, dignity, and a minimum of reciprocity. He tried not to think too much about it. He filled his time with reading, short walks, and small adjustments around the house. Sometimes he would stop in the middle of a task and wonder if he had been too harsh. But all it took was remembering the whispered conversations between the couple, the words his granddaughter had overheard in secret, and the folders stuffed with clauses disguised as care for his conviction to return. Protecting oneself was not selfishness. It was necessity, especially when the threat came from where it was least expected. What he didn't expect was to receive, a week later, a letter, handwritten, on ordinary paper, with shaky but legible handwriting. No return address, but with a perfume scent he would recognize anywhere. It was the same Maria had worn since the days he met Enrique. The letter began cold, almost technical, as if it were written out of obligation. But, the lines went on. It began to change tone. Maria spoke of frustration, of the fear of growing old without guarantees, of feeling invisible even inside her own home. She admitted that the plan had been motivated by greed, yes, but also by despair. That it didn't justify it, but explained it. She apologized, in a crooked way, and said she saw in Alejandra what she had lost in herself. At the end, a short sentence. I don't know if we are monsters or just bad people trying to get it right. The wrong way. Antonio read the letter 3 times, not to seek excuses, but to try to understand. And for the first time, he felt there might still be something to rebuild. Not now, but someday. Even so, he decided not to reply. Not yet. Because silence sometimes teaches more than any sermon. And because forgiveness does not need to come before reflection. He put the letter away in a drawer, along with other documents that were now part of the new life he was building. That same afternoon, he visited Alejandra at school again. He had arranged with the administration to pick her up by surprise. When she came out the door with her backpack on her back and a crooked bow in her hair, she ran to him with a smile that erased any lingering trace of bitterness. They went to get ice cream, as they used to when she was younger. They laughed, talked about simple things, cartoons, friends, tests. She didn't ask anything about her parents, nor did he bring it up. They were there in the present. And that was enough. At the end of the afternoon, when he dropped her off at home, Antonio simply said, "Remember that secret you told me? It saved Grandpa's life. And one day, you'll understand how big that is." Alejandra didn't say anything. She just hugged her grandfather as if she never wanted to let him go again. That night, after leaving Alejandra at home, Antonio drove through the already dark streets, the headlights illuminating parts of the city like someone revealing sections of a book. Beige. The engine made a constant, almost hypnotic, but as he tried to organize his thoughts, there was no clear sense of victory. On the contrary, what prevailed was a mix of relief and a deep exhaustion, the kind that cannot be cured with a night's sleep. At times, the image of his granddaughter, smiling over ice cream, would flash before him, warming his chest. At others, the memory of Enrique's empty gaze would drag him down. He stopped at a traffic light and watched a couple arguing on the sidewalk, gesturing exaggeratedly. He thought about how people's lives were made of small and large ruptures, and how, that day, he himself had caused one of the biggest he had ever lived. The light turned green, and he drove on, but without hurry. For the first time, he felt he didn't need to get anywhere quickly. When he got home, he set the keys on the table and stood still in the hallway for a few seconds, listening to the distant sound of the city outside. It was as if the world carried on the same, indifferent to what had just happened. He took off his coat, hung it carefully, and went to the kitchen. He put water on to boil, more out of habit than thirst. While waiting, he opened the drawer where he kept letters, old photos, and newspaper clippings. Memories of a life he used to revisit when loneliness pressed too hard. He took out a picture of Alejandra as a baby, wrapped in a blue blanket, with Enrique smiling in the background. He looked at that image for long minutes, trying to find the son he knew there, before everything got complicated. He wondered when exactly ambition had become stronger than affection. The kettle whistled, breaking the trance. He made tea and took the cup to the porch, where the cold night wind seemed to carry away part of the weight he was carrying. On the porch, he sat in the wicker armchair that already knew the shape of his body well. The sound of leaves brushing against each other came along with the gentle aroma of tea, creating a kind of sensory refuge from heavier thoughts. He remembered when, still young, he watched his own father deal with betrayals from partners and acquaintances. At the time, he didn't understand how his father managed to remain calm, how he didn't go straight for confrontation, for scandal. Now, decades later, he realized there was a silent power in restraint. It wasn't weakness, it was strategy. And it was that strategy that had allowed him to make it this far intact, despite the blows. He took a sip of tea and thought that perhaps, in time, Enrique might come to see that as well. But he wasn't under any illusions. Change required more than fleeting remorse. It demanded courage to face one's own reflection without filters. The silence of the night was interrupted by his cell phone vibrating on the side table. It was a message from Hector. Everything recorded. Document secure. Don't worry. Antonio replied only with, "Thank you, my friend." There was nothing more to say it. At least not at that moment. He imagined Maria's expression when she realized there was nothing she could do to reverse what had happened. It wasn't a cruel pleasure. It was the feeling of a duty of protection fulfilled. He knew that somewhere in her mind, the awareness had already settled in that they had gone too far. And maybe that was the beginning of some change, even if a small one. He leaned back again, gazing at the sky, where few stars dared to compete with the glow of the city lights. Thought about how all of this could have been avoided with an honest conversation, and how trust, once broken, rarely returns to its original form. Even so, he allowed himself to imagine a future where things wouldn't end in total rupture. Before going to sleep, he decided to write in his notebook, the same one he had used in the guest room to organize the count. He wrote down not only what had happened, but also the sensations, gestures, and phrases that had stayed with him. It was almost as if he wanted to leave a record for the Antonio of the future, so he would never forget how it all unfolded. Not out of resentment, but as a reminder of the importance of staying alert, even among those we love. Closing the notebook, he ran his hand over its worn cover and felt a strange mixture of gratitude and sadness. Gratitude for having managed to protect himself and his granddaughter. Sadness for needing to protect himself precisely from those who should have been at his side. He turned off the lights, went to his room, and as he lay down, he realized that despite the turmoil, sleep came more easily than he had expected. Perhaps because, for the first time in a long while, he felt he had done exactly what needed to be done. The next morning, Antonio woke before sunrise, as he used to when he still led early morning meetings at the company. His body seemed to know there was something important to process, even if his mind wanted rest. He got up slowly, stretching his back, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. As a strong aroma filled the air, he opened the window to let in the fresh dawn breeze. Outside there was an almost absolute silence, broken only by the distant crowing of a rooster and the sound of a garbage truck far away. He took his cup, sat at the table, and stared into nothing, remembering Alejandra's expression when he announced the educational fund. That mixture of surprise and innocence was the image he wanted to keep of his granddaughter and protect, at any cost, from the shadows already circling the family. After coffee, he decided to do something he hadn't done in months, go for a walk around the neighborhood. He put on a simple sweatshirt, laced up his sneakers, and wandered through the quiet streets, waving to neighbors already tending to their gardens or walking their dogs. Passing by the bakery, the owner, a short Portuguese man named Manuel, waved and invited him in. He accepted, leaving with a fresh, still warm loaf, wrapped in brown paper, on the way home. With the smell of bread mingling with the lingering taste of coffee, he realized there was something therapeutic in the simple routine, in contact with people who had no interest in his wealth, only in his presence. That realization brought a certain comfort, as if life were reminding him that not every bond was fragile or tainted by greed. Back home, Antonio sat on the porch again, this time with the bread and a fresh cup of coffee. He decided to open the printed newspaper, a habit he had been abandoning in favor of digital news, but which still gave him a sense of control over the day. Flipping through the pages, he found an article about scams against the elderly, many of them perpetrated by close family members. He read every line carefully, feeling a mix of anger and resignation. He wasn't alone in that statistic, but that was no comfort. On the contrary, it showed the size of the problem. He took his notebook and jotted down some excerpts from the article, thinking he might write an essay or testimony to warn others. He knew his story could serve as an example, not to expose those involved, but to show that it was possible to protect oneself without losing one's humanity entirely. Later, he decided to call Hector, not to talk about banks or documents, but simply to thank him for being there the day before. They talked for almost an hour, reminiscing about old stories, business trips, and even some mistakes they had made in the past. They left together, and for the first time since the episode, Antonio felt a genuine lightness. Hector mentioned that, if he wanted, he could recommend a lawyer, specialized in asset protection, someone who had handled similar cases before. Antonio said he would think about it, but for now, he just wanted to observe how Enrique and Maria would behave in the coming weeks. He didn't want to act out of resentment. He preferred to let their actions speak louder than any apology. In the late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the buildings, Antonio received an unexpected call. It was Alejandra's school principal. At first, he thought it might be a problem, but her calm and cordial voice quickly eased his worry. "Mr. Antonio, I just wanted to tell you that your granddaughter spoke a lot about you today. She said you had a special day together eating ice cream and that you're her hero." Those words moved him more than any formal recognition he had ever received. He thanked her, trying to disguise the emotion in his voice, and promised to visit the school more often. When Ehungapi spent a few minutes looking at the phone, feeling a mixture of pride and responsibility, being someone's hero, especially a child's, was no light Thailand. He knew he would have to honor it every day, with or without big confrontations. In the days that followed, Antonio began to notice the small details of his routine more, as if wanting to make sure nothing slipped by. Unnoticed, every trip to the market, every chat with neighbors, every phone call seemed to carry a different meaning. It wasn't paranoia, but heightened awareness, the same he used when negotiating important contracts. At the same time, he sought to fill his time with activities that brought him joy, gardening, reading, and even some old recipes he had learned from his wife. The smell of cornbread baking in the oven, for example, brought back memories of family afternoons. Before any sign of rupture, he realized that, more than protecting assets, he was trying to preserve the good parts of life that still remained intact. One rainy afternoon, he received a short message from Enrique. "Can we talk?" Antonio took almost an hour to reply. He didn't want his son's anxiety to set the pace of the conversation. He answered calmly, "We can, but here at my house, and no surprises." Enrique agreed, and they set the meeting for 2 days later. In that time, Antonio thought a lot about how to conduct the meeting. He didn't want to turn it into a courtroom, but he also wouldn't soften what needed to be said. He planned to ask direct questions instead of making accusations. After all, sometimes the answer itself reveals more than any judgment. When the day came, Antonio set the living room in a simple yet welcoming way. He made fresh coffee, placed a plate of cookies on the table, and opened the windows to let the air circulate. He wanted to create an environment where the conversation could flow without the feeling of an ambush. Enrique arrived on time, wearing a dress shirt that had clearly spent little time off the hanger. The handshake was firm but cold. They sat across from each other, and the initial silence was filled only by the sound of rain hit in the glass. Antonio was the first to speak. "Enrique, I need to understand at what point you thought it was right to decide for me." His son took a deep breath, but took a while to respond. Enrique began by saying he didn't know where to start, that things had gotten out of control. He spoke of genuine concerns about his father's health, mixed with unconvincing justifications for the guardianship plan. Antonio listened in silence, observing not only the words, but also the tone and gestures. He noticed there was regret, but also a certain wounded pride that kept his son from admitting the seriousness of what he had done. When Enrique finished, Antonio simply said, "The problem wasn't you worrying. It was deciding. For me, without including me in the conversation, that's not courage, control. And control isn't love." The conversation went on for over an hour, alternating moments of tension and long pauses, as if each needed time to process what the other was saying. Antonio made a point of mentioning Alejandra, of saying that her honesty had been what saved the situation. Enrique seemed touched, but also uncomfortable perhaps, realizing that his own daughter had been more loyal to her grandfather than to him. In the end, there was no reconciliatory hug or emotional promises, just a tacit agreement that they would need time to redefine their relationship. Antonio knew that, even with goodwill, some cracks never fully close. In the days that followed, Antonio returned his focus to his granddaughter. He spent more time with her, taking her to the park, helping with schoolwork, and listening to her endless stories about classmates and teachers. He realized that every moment together strengthened the bond that nothing could corrupt. He also began to teach her small lessons about responsibility and trust, without turning it into a lecture, using simple examples, stories from his own life, so she would understand the value of keeping one's word and staying true to those one loves. He felt that by taking care of her, he was also taking care of himself. One afternoon, while helping Alejandra put together a puzzle, he received a call from Maria. Her voice sounded hesitant, almost shy, something rare for someone used to speaking with confidence. "Antonio, I wanted to thank you for reading my letter and for not answering it. It made me think." He listened in silence, letting her continue. Maria spoke about the financial pressure she had been under, the fear of losing her standard of living, and how that had distorted her priorities. She didn't apologize directly, but admitted she had crossed boundaries. Antonio replied briefly, "Thinking is a start, but it's only the first step." That conversation with Maria left Antonio pensive. He realized that despite everything, there was still a part of him that wanted to believe in the possibility of change, not out of naivety, but from understanding that people are more complex than their mistakes. Even so, he would not lower his guard. He would stay alert, without letting resentment consume him. From that moment on, he decided his priority would be to create a safe environment for Alejandra, and to keep his own independence intact, no matter the cost. One Saturday morning, Hector invited him to attend a lecture on financial education for seniors. Antonio, who would normally avoid public events, accepted. He thought he might not only learn, but also share his experience. During the lecture, he realized that many people there had stories similar to his, some even harsher. At the end, when the moderator opened the floor for questions, Antonio gave a brief account of what he had been through without naming names, but with enough detail to warn others. He received applause and even invitations to speak at other gatherings. He left with the feeling that turning pain into shared learning was one of the noblest ways to give meaning to what he had endured. In the days that followed, he began writing a fuller account of his experience, thinking he might publish it in a blog or a magazine aimed at senior readers. Writing was a way to organize not only the facts, but also the emotions. He revisited every detail, every expression, every silence from that day at Enrique's house. Sometimes he had to stop and take a deep breath before continuing, but he felt this record would be important not only for him, but for anyone who might read it. At the same time, he kept up his routine with Alejandra, who was his point of balance amid all those reflections. In the end, he decided to keep the document alongside his will and the papers for the educational fund. It was a piece of history he wanted to survive the passage of time as a silent warning for future generations. He didn't know whether Enrique or Maria would ever see that text, but he knew that Alejandra, once grown, could read it and better understand what her grandfather had gone through to protect her, and with that perhaps she would learn to protect herself and those she loved. That idea brought him a peace no forced reconciliation could ever offer. One sunny afternoon, a few weeks later, Antonio decided to do something he had been putting off for a long time: visit the cemetery where his wife was buried. He brought fresh flowers, choosing the simplest and prettiest he could find, and walked slowly to the grave. Sitting on the stone bench beside it, he began to speak as if she were there, listening. He told her about Alejandra, about what had happened with Enrique and Maria, and about the decisions he had made. He spoke frankly, as they had always done with each other. There was something comforting in that one-sided conversation, this sense that somehow his words were finding their way. When he rose to leave, he felt a strange lightness, as if he had received a silent piece of advice. On the way back, he decided to stop at an old bookstore he used to frequent. The owner, a white-mustached gentleman named Ricardo, recognized him immediately and said he had saved a special book for him, a rare edition of The Old Man and the Sea by Hemingway. Antonio leafed through the pages carefully, inhaling the characteristic scent of aged paper. He bought the book and began reading it that very night. The story of Santiago, the old fisherman, seemed to echo his own recent journey, the silent struggle against greater forces, the fatigue, but also the dignity of resisting without breaking. He read late into the night, and upon closing the book, he realized he wasn't merely consuming a story. He was seeing himself in it. The following Sunday, he received an unexpected visit. Maria showed up alone, unannounced, bringing an orange cake she had baked herself. The simple gesture, coming from someone used to delegating such tasks, surprised him. They sat on the porch, drinking coffee. Maria spoke less about justifications and more about feelings. She said she had reflected a lot since their last conversation and was trying to understand how to stop seeing people as resources or guarantees. Antonio listened without interrupting. At the end, he thanked her for the cake and the visit, but made it clear that trust is not rebuilt with a single gesture. It is built day by day, and he would watch her actions over time. With Enrique, the relationship was still marked by long silences and sporadic messages. Sometimes he would send photos of Alejandra at school, presentations, or during leisure activities, as a timid way to keep some connection. Antonio would respond with likes and few words, but always show an interest in his granddaughter. He knew that forcing a reconciliation would only create new frustrations. It was better to let time do the work of either bringing them closer or separating them for good. Meanwhile, he focused on creating happy memories with Alejandra, memories that would remain with her regardless of what happened among the adults. It was during one of these visits to his granddaughter that Antonio realized how quickly she was growing. They were at the park, and without realizing it, she began repeating some of the lessons he had taught her weeks earlier about honesty, respect, and courage. Hearing her speak with such conviction, even without fully grasping the depth of the words, gave him a sense of mission accomplished. He thought that if everything else failed, at least that seed had been planted. One night, While going through some papers, he found Maria's letter again. He read it once more, but now with different eyes. Not because the situation had changed drastically, but because he himself had changed. He was less weighed down by anger and more open to seeing nuances. It didn't erase the wrongdoing, but it suggested that perhaps deep down there was a genuine desire for change. He put the letter away again, this time without the heaviness he had felt before, as someone keeps something that one day might be reread fondly. The following month, he participated in another lecture on asset protection. This time, as the main guest, he told his story in greater detail, including the hardest parts to admit. He spoke about love, trust, betrayal, and above all, resilience. At the end, a woman approached him with tears in her eyes, saying she would speak to a grandson that very night about some suspicious documents. It was in that moment Antonio realized his experience was helping prevent other stories like his from repeating, and that gave everything an unexpected meaning. Returning home, he found a simple envelope at his door, with no sender. Inside was a photograph of Alejandra holding a drawing at Wasim, smiling broadly, holding her hand. On the back, in a child's handwriting, was the sentence, "Grandpa is my hero forever." He felt a lump in his throat. He placed the photo in his notebook, in the same spot where he had recorded everything about that tense day at Enrique's house. It wasn't just a drawing, it was proof that, despite everything, he had managed to preserve what truly mattered. With Alejandra's birthday approaching, Antonio decided to prepare a surprise. He spent days planning, buying materials, and even asking friends for help. On the day of the party, he brought a personalized photo album with images from her birth to the present, interspersed with small handwritten phrases and advice. When she opened the gift and began flipping through it, her eyes sparkled. "Grandpa, is this just for me?" she asked. "Just for you, and it always will be," he replied. It was one of the rare moments when everyone in the family, including Enrique and Maria, shared a genuine smile, however brief. After the party, Antonio felt that something, however small, had changed. It might not have been a complete reconciliation, but it was the beginning of understanding, and that was enough for now. He had learned that not all stories have neatly tied endings. Some remain open, rewriting themselves little by little. And he was willing to accept that, as long as the principles he had set for himself and Alejandra remained intact. Months later, on an ordinary morning, he received a call from Enrique. This time, it wasn't to ask for anything or to make excuses. It was simply to say he was proud of his daughter and to thank Antonio for everything he did for her. It was a short but sincere conversation. When he hung up, Antonio realized that perhaps this was the true beginning of something new between them. He didn't know how far it would go, but he was open to finding out. Over time, his relationship with Maria also changed. They didn't become confidants, but they could talk without the constant weight of the past. She began inviting him to occasional lunches, and little by little, their interactions stopped being so tense. Antonio remained vigilant, but no longer felt the same need to be armed at all times. It was like walking through a terrain that had once been mined, but was now beginning to bloom again. On Antonio's next birthday, Alejandra prepared a reverse surprise. A video with messages from friends, neighbors, and even Hector, all thanking him for some help or advice he had given over the years. Watching it was like receiving living proof that, even in silence, he had touched many lives. When the video ended, Alejandra ran to hug him and said, "You always said you wanted to protect me, Grandpa, but I want to protect you too." He smiled, holding back tears, and replied, "Then we're even, my little one." That night, sitting on the porch with a glass of wine, Antonio looked at the sky and thought about everything that had changed since that Saturday at Enrique's house. It was not just about money, papers, or inheritance. It was about dignity, about teaching by example, and about resisting without losing tenderness. He knew the road ahead could still have obstacles, but he also knew he was ready. After all, he had already faced what he feared most, betrayal from where he least expected it, and he had won, not with brute force, but with intelligence and heart. And there, under the night sky, Antonio understood that the true victory was not in having protected his assets, but in being preserved the integrity and love of those who truly mattered. The rest, as he always said, life would take care of in due time.